Right, thank you everyone for tuning in. It's really good to have David give us a talk on the birds of Colonsay and Oronsay. He's been a member for many years and has been visiting Colonsay for many, many years, longer than that. And it'll be really nice to have an overview of Isla's Colonsay and Oronsay's birds. I've visited many times. I'm sure many of others of you have visited Colonsay on plenty of occasions, and to have the expertise of your knowledge and open up the spectre of what the bird life is doing there, that would be lovely. We'll have questions at the end, and I'll leave the chat open if anyone else wants to catch up with each other for a wee while afterwards. But I'll pass you over to David. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. I thought I'd start just with this picture, which is the view of the paps that most folk on Islay don't see. You see them from the south or from the east as you go across on the ferry. This is the view from west, the view from the other side, or the best side. This talk has one or two graphs in it, and if you're not into graphs, just think of them as the paps of Jura. The talk is a product of many years of visiting the islands. Shall I say that I first went on the Loch Eel and the Loch Nevis? Those of you who know the island well will be able to date that from that point of view. And it's a product of very many years and help of a lot of people. I think one of them is in the audience tonight. Thank you, Val. And I want to pay tribute to Ian Fisher and Mike Peacock, or the late Mike Peacock, who helped write the book that this book is based around. And it's the book of the birds of the Colonsay and Oronsay, which is a kind of an island aviofauna and a bird atlas for the island. And this is the only advert that there is in it. But it was the preparation of this book and its text that led to many of the stories that are going to come out tonight. It has an account of all the species that occurred on the island, distribution maps based on the atlas of where they occur on the island, and population trends for some of them. And we're going to talk about some of the species on the island and also explore the history. And unlike many islands, Colonsay and Oronsay's bird records actually go back thousands of years, because we're fortunate to have a good archaeological record for what birds have occurred on the island kind of 4,000 to 6,000 years ago when the Mesolithic lived. And this wonderful grassy or marram grass covered mound on Oronsay is a shell midden, and there are 5 of these on Oronsay, and they're big heaps of, and if you dig into them, the remains of shells, but there's also plenty of other bones, and those bones contain bird bones, which tell us something about the history or the historical birds on the records of birds on the island, which kind of do open up one or two interesting questions and comments. And they were first discovered in the late 1800s by Symington Grieve, who got help from Anderson and Bishop, kind of carried it into the early 20th century. And then Professor Paul Mellors of Sheffield and latterly Cambridge University did extensive, what I kind of describe as forensic excavations of them in the 1970s and wrote them up in the book that you see in the top right there. And they contain kind of things like barb points, little stone scoops that they use for eating, scooping the meat out of the limpets. And they were very much hunter-gatherers. The sort of work that is being done by Steve Mythen on Islay now as well. And the early excavation finds in the 19th and early 20th century kind of found 14 species of birds, and they're listed there. Those in reds have not been found in subsequent excavations. But the big find at the time was the great auk, which had not long gone extinct. And to know that it actually occurred in the Hebrides, or the Inner Hebrides, was at that time was quite exciting. And Symington Grieve who kind of led or was the impetus behind the early excavations, went on to write a book on all the known extant remains of the great auk around the world, and all the museums, all the bones, all the skins, and all the eggs. But it was perhaps the 1970s excavations, which were carried out on Castle and Gillian, which was where I showed the photograph, and Knock Cuig, which Shelmid number 5, that really is, by Paul Mellors, that provided a lot of extra information on the ecology of these early people. But unfortunately, the finds in terms of the bird bones were not actually published in his big account. But Don Bramwell, who was the leading exponent of identifying bird bones, did actually identify all those bones and count them, and his findings are contained in the book, and they have some really quite interesting things that were around, and Mesolithic man was clearly catching and presumably eating at the time. And I just thought it'd be useful just to look at some of those of wetland birds. There were grey-lag geese and even a crane, which by modern bird standards in the west coast of Scotland was really quite a remarkable sighting. Quail, spotted crake, corncrake, water rail, all do occur, but it's the relative proportions of lots of 4 spotted crakes compared to 2 corncrakes. Mesolithic man had the ability to catch buzzards and sparrowhawks at the time, and a small number of waders. But it was other more abundant resources that the Midden shed quite a light on, that there were 67 remains of 67 individual great auks in Knock Cuig, which indicates that it really was quite an abundant resource. It didn't answer the question whether they bred on the islands or whether they were caught at sea, because this flightless bird would be relatively straightforward to catch, and it would just walk up onto low rocky islands. And it's quite possible that they did breed on Colonsay and Oronsay at the time. And the other one that is interesting was the remains of 20 different eiders, because there was a period during the late 1800s when it was purported that the eider had been introduced to Scotland by the Vikings. Well, these records of the bones that Mesolithic man had killed from eiders show that it predated them, the Vikings, by several thousand years, and so we have evidence that the eider was here long before then. The other, as in addition to the great auk, there were good numbers of guillemots and razorbills, plus another kind of 42 auks that were either one or the other, black guillemots, cormorants, and shags, and those are all kind of birds that are found on the island to this day. But more interestingly, unlike the ones we've just covered that are breeders on the island, they found remains of 19 gannets, 14 puffins, 10 fulmar, and 9 manx shearwaters. All of these are kind of birds that live at sea, and the easiest time, and I'm a bird rigger, the easiest time to actually get your hands on these birds is actually when they're ashore breeding. So we're left wondering whether these species were actually breeders on the island in Mesolithic times, or whether Mesolithic man was just a lot more inventive in his way of capturing these birds at sea. And this map I've put on here just shows the distribution currently of where there are gannetries around the British coastline. And if you look between Ailsa Craig and St Kilda, there's a big gap. And so there's quite possible that historically there may have been a gannetry in the Inner Hebrides, and possibly it was in Colonsay, but we have no evidence one way or the other on that. But it is interesting to note that the numbers that were actually found in these archaeological remains. And this leads on to just show perhaps the biggest difference between Colonsay's birds and those of Islay, and in particular, Colonsay geologically is very similar to the Rins, and therefore it's not surprising that its bird life is similar. But it has a very large seabird colony, and it was the numbers in that colony peaked round about the turn of the century. And at that time, there was getting close to 50,000 birds. The guillemots and razorbills are counts of individuals on the apparently occupied nests. So there at least double that number of kittiwakes on the site. Same with fulmars. But I thought it would be useful just to kind of look at the trends of some of these seabirds, because we've been doing a bit of work in terms of ringing of these seabirds. And I'll start first with the shag. It's not kind of the most common, but 170 or so nests found at the turn of the century. And kind of 3 sites have been counted on a regular basis. And these are shown on this bottom graph. And blue is the Oronsay one that Mike and Val probably would recall. The main one at Pig's Paradise, which is the largest area of seabird breeding, it has declined quite a bit since the late or just after the turn of the century. And those at Urrigig near Killearn Bay have been kind of bumping along from that point of view. And on the whole, the total population's declined since about 2004. And this bird, we know from work done by the RSPB seabird scientists who came and worked on Colonsay for a period of 4 or 5 summers. They put tiny little GPS tags and attached them to the birds that would stay for about a week or a fortnight. And they caught the birds, put them on, and then re-caught the birds to see where the birds were feeding, which was helpful to understand kind of their foraging range. And the shags were found to feed very much inshore, close to Colonsay, and didn't really go more than a kilometre or 2 from the coastline. They would just fly around the island. And indeed, one year they put a tag on one of the birds they put on the previous year, and that bird went and fed in exactly the same place it had been feeding the previous summer, and it was a small rock mount on the bottom of the sea that it seemed to be its corner store for feeding in. But by 2018, the population had declined to only about 95 occupied nests. If we look at guillemot, which is the most common species seabird on the island, and this is one in the hand that kind of we ring and we capture them. At the turn of the century, there were kind of over 25,000 birds and probably more at sea. That was the number that were on the cliffs. And we count at one site every year, and we go and count it 5 times because birds come and go. And this graph shows the trend at that one site. It's a readily accessible site, and it's not a large site. But the number has now declined to just under 20,000 individuals on the cliff. And as part of our studies, we have ringed over 1,000 of those birds since the late 1980s, some of which we are still catching kind of from the late 1980s and early 1990s. Quite a lot of young ringers come out with us now, and it's quite interesting for me to be able to hand them a bird and say to them, well, this bird is actually older than you are, because some of the birds are 30 years old. And we know from the rings that they were being recovered from France, the coast of the Bay of Biscay, the southern Irish coast, and then the English Channel coasts. And that was where we thought the bulk of them actually were wintering. But in recent years, we've actually been attaching tiny little GLS, which is a geolocator, to the legs of the birds on a ring. And that's a tiny, tiny computer with a light device, and it reads the light levels and tells you whether it's daylight or nighttime. And so from that you can work out what is the time of dusk or sunset and what is the time of sunrise. And from that, the actual time and the length of the day, you can actually work out the approximate coordinates of where that bird is, except during the equinox, when it is slightly less accurate, because the day length is similar kind of at all latitudes. But what that showed us was that actually far more of the birds were actually spending the winters off the northwest coast of Scotland, out beyond St Kilda and up towards the Faroes. And it does show kind of one of the difficulties in terms of bird ringing that rely on just finding dead birds, because that has a bias in it and where people walk along beaches to find birds. But what we do know, from the point of view of their longevity, that over 95% of these adults are living from year to year, and therefore their need to breed is not at a fast rate. Is not high. Like the guillemot, another seabird cliff nesters, the razorbill occurs in smaller numbers, about a tenth of the numbers of the guillemots on Colonsay. And at the one site that we've monitored, you can see in the graph at the bottom, it has kind of bounced along up and down from that point of view. And it had not declined to the same extent as the guillemot when the whole colony was recounted in 2018. The colony count is quite an arduous undertaking. It takes about a week to work the coastline, counting every cliff face with a telescope and a clicker, just working along methodically, counting all the birds on the cliff. And you working your way around takes time. We've ringed birds at Pig's Paradise since the late 1980s, like the guillemots, and we know that the juveniles, they weren't winter further south, or certainly where they're recovered, and they've been recovered right down to the south of Spain, and adults south to the Bay of Biscay. And some of the juveniles have been found right inside into the Mediterranean. So they know what to do on a winter like the one we've had, is to get out of the Hebrides and head south. The first kind of collation of the records of the birds on Colonsay was developed by this gentleman, John de Vere Loder, in his book on the islands of Colonsay and Oronsay in 1935. He was a relative of the then Lord Strathcona, and he was asked to write a book about everything that was known about the islands. And to some extent, it was thought to be a little bit of a reaction to another book that had been written, and this was, so he collated all the sources of information on the history of the island and its buildings, its archaeology, and there are some very interesting and useful appendices within it. And these are some of the texts that he looked at. He went through all the classic texts on early references to the island and Thomas Pennant's visit. And each of these different documents, other than the one in red, is quoted and provide a bit of information on the birds in history on the island. Interestingly, he didn't quote My Happy Hunting Grounds by Gaythorne Hardy. Now, Gaythorne Hardy was related to Baltolloch Estate and visited Baltolloch Estate just down the road from where I live in Kilmartin on a regular basis. And he rented the sporting on the island of Colonsay in the late 1800s and very early 1900s from the previous owner prior to Lord Strathcona, from Lord McNeill. And there's some interesting kind of observations that I'll come back to later on that. So in Loder's acknowledgement, he makes a very clear statement that where there's no specific evidence for identification is given in the bird list. He said it was compiled by Mr. John Bevan and the Honourable Lewis Palmer, and the period when he did it. And that certainly got me scratching my head that who were John Bevan and Lewis Palmer, and what was their association with the island. And the first thing I did was I spent quite a lot of time from British birds from 1930s onwards, looking for their obituaries, and I could find no evidence in British birds that they were part of the ornithological community that was contributing to British birds at the time. But it was relatively straightforward to find out who Lewis Palmer was. He was born and died in the 1970s. He was the son of the Earl of Selborne, and he married John Loder's sister. And therefore, he was the brother-in-law of the person who compiled the book, and that was why he had been invited to kind of help contribute the list. And all his papers are in the Bodleian Library, which will be an interesting adjunct to the work I did, because I worked from the book rather than going back to the original sources. John Bevan was a more interesting character. And he was Oxford and Eton and British Army officer and stockbroker, and kind of very much part of the big house, or Lord Strathcona's set of friends. But the remainder of his story was one that was really quite a remarkable one, that I was kind of nervous that I'd maybe not got the right John Bevan. But I was fortunate enough to meet the late Lord Strathcona, the son actually of the laird in the 1930s. And unfortunately, by the time I had the chance to talk to him, he was suffering from Alzheimer's, but not seriously. And I asked him who John Bevan, or whether he knew Johnny Bevan, because the current laird, and who's of my generation, didn't know him and said, "You must speak to Father." And Lord Strathcona, of course, knew him very, very well. And his condition at the time was such that his memory was very clear, and we spent a good hour talking about his wartime memories, because John Bevan was actually Winston Churchill's, or one of Winston Churchill's chief dissemblers. And Lord Strathcona's remarks when I asked him whether he knew Johnny Bevan was, yes, he was a great friend of Winston's. And his job was to provide all sorts of false trails for Hitler in relation to the D-Day landings. And he was involved very heavily in that. And clearly it was not an aspect of the association of a small island off the west coast of Scotland with kind of what went on in the Second World War. Churchill had been on Colonsay when he was First Lord of the Admiralty, and climbed Ben Oronsay to watch a naval exercise taking place offshore. And within that first list are some of the early rarities found on the island, and two of them are really quite remarkable. This bird here was found in a ditch on the 1st of January. It hadn't been suffering from hogmanay, but it's now known as a white-faced storm petrel, but it is at the time it was known as a frigate petrel. And this is the actual individual. It's now preserved in the museum in Edinburgh, and is the only record for that species ever to have been found in Britain. And then the second one, these are 3 images of the same skin of a yellow-billed cuckoo, a North American cuckoo, that was found in the woods at Colonsay House in 1903, which at the time was the first record found in Scotland. But the island was quite different at that time, and this is a photograph of Colonsay House where Lewis Palmer and John Bevan would have stayed when they were on the island. And the woodlands at the time would be very much younger. This is a photograph taken in the 1930s. These trees are now very mature. But what it does do is it points to the changing avifauna on the island. And you can track through the records that woodland birds like the coal-tit didn't arrive, and there were no records on the island prior to 1910. And then the blue-tit was not even seen on the island until the 1930s. And it, remarkably, not until the 1960s was a great tit seen on the island. And these are all birds that we now all take pretty much for granted on many of the Hebridean islands, maybe not Colin Tyree, but they're now well established. But there was a time when we were not established on the island. Within that list, there are also some really interesting records that perhaps talk about the social structure of the time. And some of them were from Malcolm McNeill, who was the then farmer on Oronsay. And many of his records were, I've put this deliberately, were put in square brackets. And that was because the big hoose or the Lewis Palmer and John Bevan didn't accept Malcolm McNeill's records. And these are a series, I'm going to talk about these ones in red. And these first 7 species are all species which we have seen on the island again. And the only one that Malcolm McNeill believed he'd seen on the island that has not been seen subsequently is shorelark. But it was quite clear that what was said about whooper swan was doubtfully by Malcolm McNeill was what Palmer and Bevan said within their list. But it's an annual migrant and a winter visitor, sometimes in quite large numbers, up to 70, and you'll know, and it's regular and winters on Isla, and just occasionally it occurs in summer on Colonsay. And these are the numbers that were seen on Isla, on Oronsay in total between 2003 and 2014 from Mike's counts. And you can see it is a very regular species, but Loder's list doesn't include it. And that was same was grey plover reported as seen on several occasions. Well, all the information that we have in terms of monthly occurrence and annual occurrences, it occurs on a very regular basis. It's this bird in the central one with 2 golden plovers either side on the island. And Little Stint, which Malcolm McNeill believed he saw on Oronsay in the autumn of 2012, but his record wasn't acceptable. It's a scarce spring migrant and a regular autumn migrant. And perhaps what it does point to, and one of the difficulties in studying the West Coast is the kind of where the power was and who kept the records. And equally, round about the 1900s, a very high proportion of the population were Gaelic speakers on the island. And sadly, there are very, very few records of the Gaelic speakers' observations of the birds on the island at the time. And that's true for much of the West Coast because it was an oral language rather than a written language. And I think we underestimate what was seen in the past because we don't have access to a written record from that point of view. When the Loder was writing his book, the island was coming to the end of what I kind of refer to as the sporting era on the island because the Gaithorn Hardy had rented the island, and all of the species in this photograph, kind of the grey partridge and the blackcock and the red grouse, were all introduced, and the pheasant were all introduced to Colonsay at some time in the past. And the only one that kind of you might see in a visit nowadays is a pheasant. And that's possibly because there's still being few being introduced from that point of view. And the sporting influence had a big influence on the island and some of the other birds. Following the First World War, black grouse became extinct, and there was attempts made to reintroduce it afterwards, but they were unsuccessful. And I think even there were a few introduced this century, 4 birds. I think Izzy Baker got quite a surprise when she saw one sitting on Oronsay. There was a lot of strict game management going on. And I've been fortunate enough to read the diaries of Jerry Sandeman, who was from Edinburgh. And I met as a teenager on the East Coast, and he heard of my interest in Colonsay and lent me his diaries because he'd been visiting for many years. And his diaries describe the nest destruction of sparrowhawk nests. The game book, which was available to John and Pamela Clark when they were on, they found that in 1935, 5 buzzards were destroyed. Heron's eggs were destroyed, or that was noticed in Jerry Sandeman's diaries. And certain species, golden eagle and hen harrier, were absent as breeders and didn't return till the dates kind of given there. So the kind of that early part, certainly the first half of the 20th century and the latter part of the 19th century, birds were being destroyed, and the avifauna was very different at that time. And Gaithorne Hardy describes quite a lot of his shooting expeditions in this book called My Happy Hunting Ground. There were clearly other birds on the island, and George Lodge, who's a very famous ornithological artist, was asked to portray some of the birds, a peregrine here and a raven. And this particular frontispiece in the front of this book had me scratching my head for many years until I saw another of Gaithorne Hardy's book, where he includes this photograph. And you wonder whether George Lodge actually visited the island or not, but you'll see, of course, the profile of this hill, the position of this island, and then these three little bits of jagged rock are exactly the same. And so this photograph may well have been used to give the background to this painting for this. But what is even more remarkable is that if you go there now, you can still see those three little bits of jagged rock and the same cliff, and clearly the background of Portlow just beside the airstrip, or just southwest of the airstrip on Colonsay, is where the background to this famous painting was based. There have been some recent reintroductions associated with sporting to the island, and I was going to, there are a few red leg partridges have been introduced this century, but they only survive a few years and then kind of peter out. The climate and the conditions are clearly not ideal for them. But the Canada geese were first introduced in 1934 by the then gamekeeper Malcolm Clark, and he thought it would be helpful to have some geese that would call in other geese as they flew over. And he introduced two pairs. And they're now regular breeders on the island, and they increased to the 60s by around about 65 in the late 60s. And there's now anything between 60 and 100 birds on the island throughout the year. But it has spread from Colonsay kind of throughout Mid-Argyll. I think you've been fortunate on Isla that you've not had many, but I see they're now on Jura on a regular basis. They're on Glass Elan, just on the Sound there, and certainly in Mid-Argyll and the islets up around Scarba and north into that archipelago. There are Canada geese everywhere, and there's probably now over 2,000 birds in Argyll. So kind of a big change. Some of those may have come from other directions, but many of them probably originated from Colonsay. In contrast, the goose that you all know so well on Isla has a long history on Colonsay and Oronsay, and Thomas Pennant records it there in the 18th century. But by the 1930s, there were only about 50 being seen on the island. It was really quite a rare bird, and that was probably because it was being shot at on a regular basis. But the main flock is now on Oronsay, where there's been some reseeding and fertilising, and that's encouraged. I mean, you can see the graph that they're regularly 300 or 400 right through to the round about the turn of the century, and then there has been a steady increase now, and now up to 4,500. Unfortunately, there's not been coordinated counts between Colonsay and Oronsay, and it's not straightforward to do when you've got a tidal area between the two areas. But the numbers on Colonsay itself is increasing, and I don't doubt that the management scheme that has taken place on Isla has led to birds moving to quieter places in Colonsay, and certainly some of the other islands. I saw some on the island of Ling just the week before last. So the management plan that you've got or have had on Isla has certainly changed their distribution. Spring's coming in the next few weeks, and the cuckoo is a bird that many islanders look out for and listen for. And we're fortunate in terms of our understanding of the birds of Colonsay and Oronsay that John and Pamela Clark, when they lived on the islands in the mid-80s to the mid-90s, had a very good relationship with the islanders and kept very good records. And it allowed us to say, well, what is happening to the arrival and the timing of the first cuckoo on Colonsay? And certainly we're led to believe that spring migrants are becoming earlier throughout Scotland because of climate change. And there's about 20 to 25 calling males on Colonsay most years, and they lay their eggs in meadow pipits' nests. And this little graph shows the date of when cuckoos were recorded, first recorded singing on the island, from the 70s from Barry Alexander, then the 80s and 90s from the Clarks, and then more recent records. But interestingly, in the 1970s, in 5 years, the kind of median arrival date was the 22nd of April, and then 22nd of April in the 80s to 90s, and since the turn of the century, it's been 22nd of April again. So there's not any real evidence of a change for cuckoos arriving earlier on Colonsay or on Oronsay. When I talked about the seabirds, I didn't talk about the gulls, and I thought it would be useful just to kind of again look at what's happened in the trends on the gulls on the island. This is a picture of Killoran Bay. You can see the children have been busy building a sandcastle, and this is a flock of kittiwakes that have come in to bathe in the lagoon and the burn at the mouth in fresh water and to drink, and then they roost on the shore. And kittiwake is the kind of the most common gull on the island, and we've been studying them with some pillar ringing since the late 1980s. And they've been recovered from the Faroe Islands, Wales, and as far away as Greenland. Some of the kittiwakes cross the Atlantic and feed off the west coast of Greenland at sea during the winter. The one from Greenland was taken by an Eskimo for food. And we know from the ringing that about 85% of the adults survive from year to year. And in 2000, there were about 6,500 occupied nests. So we can see there's a peak, and this is the count from a small sample cliff, and you can see in line with many other parts of the British Isles, there's been a fairly significant decline, and the decline on in Shetland has been absolutely massive. We last recounted on Colonsay the whole colony in 2016 and found 3,500 nests. And the lad who gave me a hand to that knew the Shetland birds well. And I was really quite shocked when he said, well, there are more kittiwakes on Colonsay than there are on the whole of the Shetland Isles. And that's how dramatic the decline has been in Shetland. Now, the work on the geolocators from these birds show that these forage a bit further afield, and a lot of them feed in the tidal races. So some of them come down and feed between Islay and Jura and the Sound there, but many of them are going up and feeding off Corryvreckan and in the Great Race there where they get up Wellings. And it may be that the fish stocks in these areas are better than those further north in Shetland. And it may be that our tidal currents are providing better feeding conditions for them there. Not everybody's favourite bird in terms of the great blackback, many people don't do, but it's been on the island for many centuries. It was found in the Mesolithic remains. It was heavily persecuted during the sporting era. 42 were shot in 1 year in the 1930s, from that point of view. But numbers increased from the late 1960s when we have a seabird count, increased substantially to kind of almost to 80 pairs breeding, and then but have declined very rapidly again. And that trend is similar to the one found in herring gulls, which was also persecuted, going from 300 pairs up to well over 1,000 or over 1,000 pairs, but now back to just under 200 pairs in the whole of the island. And for these large gulls, quite a bit of the trend is thought to be related to fishery practices and the change in the number of discards, and actually in the kind of the fact that the seas have been very well harvested. The trend in large gulls is very similar to that found on the island of Canna, which were studied by Bob Swan. And they were able to show that the level of fish that were taken into Mallaig Harbour was a very good indicator of the size of the gull population. So when they were catching lots of fish and throwing lots of stuff overboard, there were lots of gulls. But as the number of fish that they caught declined, the number of gulls declined. Work on these has shown that the birds that breed on Colonsay and Oronsay winter throughout Argyll and go down into the Firth of Clyde and to the Irish Sea. Jumping on to another area study where we did done a lot of work is looking at the buzzard population on the island. It's been very much looking at the population size, ringing the youngsters for a range of birds of prey, involves nest finding, and we look at the prey remains, measure the chicks, and we also measure the population of their prey items. It's a picture of a chick on the back of Ben Oronsay looking over to Ardskinish. And these are the main prey items that they have, kind of principally rabbits, some rats, small birds, and very occasionally moths or slowworms or lizards. And kind of early on in the study, we found that by number, and these are the prey remains found in nests, half of the prey were rabbits, a sixth were rats, and roughly a third were birds. And if you looked at it by weight or by mass, rabbits were by far the most important ones. So we kind of early on set up a way of actually following what was happening to the population of rabbits on the island. And these two lines are just two different measures of the number of rabbits that we think are on the island. They don't give you absolute numbers, but they give you a trend. So in the early parts of the studies in the early 1990s, there's a declining population, a low population, which rose up until kind of 2008, and then crashed in 2010 and 2011. Many of you will remember that those were absolutely horrendously cold, icy winters, and that was combined with kind of a myxomatosis outbreak. And the rat population took many years to recover. It's only just in the last year or two, and it's on a rising trend now from that point of view. We also have looked at kind of the feathers that we find in the nest, and we found kind of 170 different birds of 23 different species. The main ones that they eat are the most common birds: meadow pipits, starlings, wheatears, and snipe. A few song thrushes and blackbirds, and these feathers here are actually feathers from a corncrake, and we've found 3 or 4 corncrakes over the year. But we don't think the buzzards actually have any influence on the numbers of corncrakes at all. I think we'll come back to corncrakes later and look at what's actually the important fact for that. But we know that the meadow pipit population has been declining slightly over the trends. These are from breeding bird survey transects carried out on Colonsay and Oronsay over the years. So we've got a reasonable handle of many of the prey items and their weights. The one that we struggled with was actually with rats, very difficult to monitor their numbers, and there was we had no ability to readily tell how much protein they were providing for the buzzard chicks. Every time we found the remains of a rat on a nest, we usually found the tail, and we measured the length of the tail. We did the same for the rabbits. The hind feet were left, and we were able to calculate from a thesis that gave us a relationship between the hind foot length and the weight of the rabbit. But we had nothing like that for rat. Step-in, the now reserve manager on Oronsay, Morgan Vaughan, who managed to dispatch 30 different rats. And after he did so, he measured the tail length and weighed them. So we were able to construct a graph that allowed us to convert all the tail lengths that we had into the kind of the amount of protein or the weight of mass of rats that the buzzards had taken in their nests. And that allowed us to look at the change in the prey in the nests over the time of the study. So this was in the late 1980s and early 1990s when we had a high rabbit population. We had relatively few rats, lots of birds, and very many rabbits. As the rabbit population declined, the number of rabbits in the nests declined, and the number of rats increased. And then the rabbits increased again just before their crash in 2010, and the rabbits have been kind of relatively low since then. And it's largely been rats that the buzzards have substituted for their prey. And if you convert that to the mass and the amount of food that they're providing, there was a period after the big crash of the rabbits in 2010 when the rats were providing over half the prey item for the chicks in the nest. And in that nest, they usually are rearing 1 to 2 young. They have a bit of competition for their nest sites with ravens, and very rarely do you see 4 eggs. This is a far more typical site with just 2 chicks or 1 chick. And the ravens actually have a not dissimilar food supply. They eat a lot of young rabbits as well. One of the things that we were also able to do was to look at, because we were measuring the chicks, we were able to look at the timing of their breeding. And we found that over the period that the buzzards were breeding slightly earlier, from 2010 from 2000 to 2010, they became progressively earlier. And that was because the spring weather was getting warmer, and we found that the eggs were being laid earlier in spring. Unfortunately, we had to kind of suspend that study because the number of buzzard chick nests for our sample declined. And this perhaps was the most interesting graph of the long-term study, was that we had a population that was relatively stable right through to 2010. It was bouncing around, but it was pretty stable over that kind of close on 22 year period. And then subsequently, we had a substantial decline in the buzzard population on the island. And a number of factors were probably coming into play there. One was that food supplies were tight for them. The rabbit population was low. But we also know that the population of golden eagles on the island actually increased. And we know that from a number of different things, we were finding that the golden eagles were actually predating the buzzards. We found remains of buzzards that had been eaten, and then just remains of the birds that were being torn apart. And equally, we found that chicks were being removed from the buzzards' nests, and we, on one occasion, we saw a golden eagle kind of going in and just completely removing the nest of a crow and taking the contents of the nest back to its nest. And we found that these eagles were specializing in raiding birds and taking young birds. We found remains of a heron in the nest, and that heron had a ring on it that we had ringed. So these were eagles that were predating on birds, and that was one of the principal reasons we think that the buzzard population has declined. Here's some pictures of the young eagles, and some years we had twins. Okay, I'm coming to close now, but there's two species. Oh, forgot this this slide. This is a picture of a golden eagle skull found on Oronsay and given to me by Mike Peacock. And if you look closely at it, it has two small holes here and here. And this skull was found in the spring, but previous autumn, the bird had been seen with injuries on its head. And if you take a golden eagle talon and pop it in there, it fits perfectly. And so what we've got a situation is that the eagle population had kind of got to capacity. The birds were beginning to fight with one another. Some might say it's sad, but equally it's a sign that we've actually got a pretty healthy population if they're sorting themselves out from that point of view. And if, good evidence again that these are birds that will take on other birds and the reason for the buzzard decline. I said I'd come back to corncrakes and just looking, I think Val, you'll recognise that picture. That's the view of your old kitchen window. This is a graph showing the population of corncrakes on the islands. These areas where there's no data, it's not a case that there were no corncrakes, we just know. And the lowest that the population declined to was just 2 males in the late 1980s. And work by the RSPB scientists to explore the causes of the decline clearly gave good management recommendations to how to improve the lot for corncrakes in terms of providing early cover like these nettles. And the hard work of the RSPB team, both on the reserve on Oronsay and with advocacy amongst the crofters and farmers on Colonsay, led to a very substantial increase in the numbers, rising right up to 85 males in 1 year. But numbers have declined in recent years. Figure in 2020 is probably a little bit questionable because surveys were restricted by COVID, but it's down to about 20 calling males across both the islands. And there's a number of reasons around that. Partly reduced cover, less agricultural incentives to provide management for corncrakes. And equally, there's been a series of autumns where harvest of a late silage crop has been very, very tricky. And I think it's reasonable to understand why some of the farmers were not as comfortable with having a late harvest, because the fields were just so wet in the autumn that they weren't able to get any of their silage off until late October and November, when its quality had declined. So it's certainly a species you've got to keep an eye on, and knowing what we've achieved in the past, it can be achieved again for a species like that. And then the other species that we share very much as a USP for the Southern Hebrides, because it's now just Isla and Colonsay and Oronsay that have chough remaining. Nowhere else in Scotland do they occur. And historically, there's interesting interaction between the two islands, in that there's times when there have been chough on Colonsay and very few on Isla. And then there have been times right up until kind of from the 19 teens through to the 1960s, there were very, very few chough on Colonsay. But there were plenty of chough on Isla, and Colonsay was recolonised in the mid to late 1960s from Isla. And one of the studies that was done by Jane Reid and one of her students was to collect feathers from, molted feathers from chough on Colonsay and on Isla, but also they got them from from Ireland, the Isle of Man, Wales, and the developing population in Cornwall, and look at the genetics of them. And that they found that the Colonsay and the Isla, the DNA on the Isla and Colonsay choughs were virtually inseparable. And that's not surprising given that Colonsay was recolonised from Isla. But equally, it was actually the population with the least variability within it. And that's been found both on Colonsay and on Isla to have a problem where some of the chicks are blind. It's a simple double recessive genetic disorder that leads to where both the parents are heterozygotes and can see a quarter of the chicks are likely to be blind. And while the chicks get to the edge of the nest, they don't survive for more than a few days. And that is a problem. But equally, there are other problems, as you well know on Isla, that the supplementary feeding has shown better survival of the young birds, and therefore the population has been maintained. As yet, little has been done on Colonsay in terms of supplementary feeding. And so what we have seen is, since a peak of 25 territories in 2005, we're now down to 5 pairs in 2020, or last year, on the island. We're fortunate, and that's largely because the young birds are not surviving their first year, while on Isla, the good work that Eric and others are doing to give supplementary feeding has meant that your juveniles are surviving better through kind of that late summer period and into the early and into the autumn. And fortunately, I think if it hadn't been for an emigration in 2020 of 7 or 8 birds from Isla onto Colonsay, I would have been very fearful for the picture on Colonsay. But we now have a small group of non-breeding birds on the island, and I suspect as a result of those birds coming from Isla, we might actually see a slight increase. But I didn't want to cover the whole of the talk on chough, but I hope that this, and it's been a bit of a rattle through, gives you a bit of a flavour for the sort of things that have come out from spending time trying to explore all the things about the birds of Colonsay and Oronsay.
Thank you very much, David. That's been very good. It's really nice to see the historical influence of bird numbers, because we can lose sight sometimes in recent numbers. So it's good to see a historical record in your talk there. Does anyone else have any questions?
I've got a question, if I may, speaking from Somerset. I was going to Isla regularly in the 1980s with Ronald Hickling, and we were observing choughs nesting in barns. They were often deformed. They had crossed beaks. And I don't know the current situation in that respect, but I just wonder whether there was a similar phase on Colonsay.
Colonsay's chuff are nests in natural sites. There's only ever been one pair that have nested in a building, or maybe a second pair tried one year to nest on the Priory in Oronsay. Deformed bills is not something that we've come across, but may again be an expression of this very narrow gene base that has been found on the Colonsay and Oronsay chuff population. I should say that Nature Scot and the Scottish Chuff Study Group are actually actively looking to how we can help chuff, and one of the strands of work is actually to look about how we improve the genetic diversity of both populations. And the Royal Zoological Society of Scotland, i.e. Edinburgh Zoo, have offered to use well-practiced techniques in rearing of chuff to a kind of captive rearing, to allow birds to be bred and brought for release. Now, that's been done very successfully in the Channel Islands. So there are techniques to allow chuff to be kind of reintroduced. But until we've got a bit of better handle how we improve the food supply, then it's not much point in doing a lot of that until you've got the food supply sorted. And the food supply is not a terrible problem. It's a relatively short part of the year where it's a problem, and probably is solvable. But we need to take kind of some emergency action to make sure we don't lose birds before we resolve those.
That's very interesting, and I was interested in supplementary feeding. I just wondered whether land management might have a part to play in what you're talking about in encouraging food supply for chuffs.
Yeah, absolutely. And that I wanted to cover a little of the historical stuff. If you look at Colonsay over the years, and we're fortunate that we've actually got a very good agricultural record for the islands. John and Pamela Clark went through agricultural records, so we actually know the sheep and cattle numbers right back to the middle of the 19th century. And when chuff were doing very well in the late 1800s and early 1900s, there were very high numbers of sheep and cattle on Colonsay. But the sheep and cattle number were reduced very substantially around about the beginning of the 20th century. And that was when chuff disappeared in Colonsay. But if you then look at when they came back in the 1960s, there was a very substantial increase in sheep numbers. And so when the sheep numbers declined from around about the turn of this century in year 2000, as a result of the change from the headage payment to an area payment, we saw quite substantial increases in the sward length in some key areas. And therefore, the actual available habitat for chuff feeding on the two islands of Colonsay and Oronsay, it has declined. So it was certainly something that we expected would happen. And certainly in the last 2 to 3 years, we've been looking quite hard about how we target grazing in some key areas, particularly in some of the western cliffs of Colonsay, to get the sward length back down again to improve them for chuff.
That's very interesting, David. I want to say thank you very much for this talk. I'm actually coming to Colonsay for the first time on the 16th of April, and I'll be staying for a week. I wondered whether there was any way in which I could contribute to the data during that period.
Well, if you give your email to the secretary, then she can pass it on to me and we can correspond offline. I think would be the best thing to do.
Thank you very much.
I might even be there at the time. So,
thank you very much.
Okay.